He was forged in the desolate fires of war, a guardian shaped by shadow and steel, a weapon honed to a razor's edge by a nation that now had little use for him. He was a man who had walked through the valleys of death and emerged not with peace, but with a quiet, consuming stillness. Silas Kane had been a Navy SEAL, an operator at the highest tier, a protector sent to the darkest corners of the world. Yet dismissed by the very system that created him, he found himself adrift in the quiet prison of civilian life, a warrior without a war. He had come to the Pacific Northwest searching for a sanctuary, a place where the ghosts of his past might be drowned out by the roar of the ocean and the whisper of the pines. What he unearthed instead was a secret that would drag him back into the world of shadows, a world where the only rule is to survive. The hunt had just begun. The Seattle mist was a constant companion, a damp grey breath that clung to the city and gave the air a sharp, clean smell of salt and rain. For Silas, it was a welcome shroud. It blurred the edges of a world that had become too sharp, too loud. Here, in a small, isolated cabin, perched on a rocky bluff overlooking the Puget Sound, he had tried to build a new kind of fortress, not of concrete and steel, but of silence and solitude. His only constant companion was Ghost, a Belgian Malinois, with a coat the color of shadow and eyes that held an unnerving intelligence. The dog was more than a pet. He was a partner, a living extension of Silas's own hyper-vigilant senses. Ghost had been with him on his final tours, a silent, four-legged operator who understood the language of tension and the scent of impending violence better than most men. Their communication was a symphony of unspoken cues, a subtle shift in weight, the flick of an ear, a low rumble in the chest that was felt more than heard. This morning, like most, they ran the coastline. The beach was a strip of grey sand and dark, wave-polished stones, littered with the skeletal remains of driftwood. The fog was thick, swallowing the horizon and muffling the sound of the churning surf. It was a world reduced to their immediate presence. Silas ran with the easy, powerful gait of a lifelong predator, his mind a practiced blank. He was escaping. He was a weapon without a target. Ghost, however, was not blank. His focus was absolute, a constant sweep of the environment. He suddenly broke stride, his head dropping low. A soft whine escaped his throat as he trotted to the high-tide line, pawing at a small, dark object half buried in the wet sand and tangled seaweed. Silas slowed, his internal alarm, long dormant, beginning to hum. He trusted the dog's instincts implicitly. Ghost didn't bark. He didn't get excited. He got serious. Silas knelt, his fingers digging into the cold sand. He pulled the object free. It was a small, black, waterproof pelican case, the kind used for sensitive electronics. It was scarred and battered, but the seal was intact. Silas's heart rate remained steady, a conditioned response, but his mind was already calculating angles, possibilities, threats. He clicked the heavy-duty latches. They opened with a pneumatic hiss. Inside, nestled in custom-cut foam, was a simple handheld GPS unit and a small folded piece of paper. He carefully unfolded the paper. It was stiff, stained a dark, rusty brown. 3 letters were scrawled across it, crude and desperate. SOS. The writing was unmistakably blood. He felt the world shift. The fog of leave, the suffocating blanket of purposeless peace, was ripped away. In its place, an ice-cold focus descended. This wasn't a random piece of flotsam. This was a message, a plea, a mission. Tell us where you are watching from and what loyalty means to you. Comment Amen below if you believe in the power of a faithful protector. God blesses you and your families. Silas returned to the cabin, moving with a renewed economy of motion that had been absent for months. The sanctuary now felt different. It was no longer a retreat. It was a forward operating base. The quiet was no longer peaceful. It was tactical, a canvas upon which he could hear the approach of a threat. Ghost shadowed him, a dark, silent sentinel, his body coiled with a familiar energy. He knew this version of Silas. This was the operator, the protector. Silas laid the GPS unit and the bloody note on the rough-hewn wooden table. He dried the unit meticulously before powering it on. The screen flickered to life, its pale green light cutting through the gloom of the cabin. It was a standard commercial model, but its memory contained only a single entry, a logged coordinate. He cross-referenced the numbers on his own topographic map. The point was less than 30 miles away, deep in the unforgiving wilderness of the Olympic National Forest, a place of towering ancient trees, dense undergrowth, and profound isolation. A perfect place to hide something, or someone. A perfect place for an ambush. His training took over, a cascade of ingrained protocols. Assess the threat, gather intelligence, prepare for engagement. He knew he couldn't walk into this blind. Information was ammunition. He needed access, data, and a second pair of eyes he could trust. The list of people who fit that description was dangerously short. He picked up his satellite phone, its presence in his go bag a testament to his inability to ever truly stand down. He dialed a number he hadn't used in over a year. It rang twice before a sharp, no-nonsense voice answered. Thorne. Dr. Aris Thorne. On paper, she was a top ER doctor at a major Seattle trauma center. Off paper, she was a former Army Ranger, a combat medic who had seen the sharp end of the spear and had the scars, both visible and not, to prove it. They had crossed paths in a world of dust and chaos, a brief but intense professional overlap built on mutual respect for competence under fire. She was fierce, emotionally, guarded, and possessed a mind like a steel trap. Aris, it's Kane. A pause on the other end, not of surprise, but of calculation. Silas, I assume you're not calling to ask about my day? Her voice was dry, clinical. I need your help, he said, his own voice direct, stripped of pleasantries. He gave her the facts, clean and sterile. The case washed ashore, the SOS, the GPS unit. He read her the serial number from the back of the device. Coordinates and a prayer. Silas, what are you walking into? The question wasn't accusatory. It was a risk assessment. She was already in the problem. Don't know. That's the problem, he replied. The unknown is the variable that gets people killed. I'm aware, she said, the edge in her voice softening slightly. All right, give me an hour. I'll run the serial, see what procurement records it might be tied to. I'll also check it against missing persons reports and Coast Guard incident logs for this area. Anything that smells wrong? Thanks, Aris. Don't thank me yet, she retorted. Just stay alive. You were always annoyingly good at that. The line went dead. Silas looked at Ghost, who sat patiently, his gaze locked on his master. The dog didn't need words. He could feel the change in the room, the shift from quiet reflection to coiled preparation. The world had become a cage of stillness for Silas. But now, someone had rattled the bars. A plea for help had given the weapon a target. The protector had found a purpose. The transition from the misty, salt-sprayed coast to the deep, verdant gloom of the Olympic National Forest was like passing through a portal into another world. The air grew heavy, thick with the smell of damp earth, decaying leaves, and the sharp, resinous scent of colossal Douglas firs. Sunlight struggled to pierce the dense canopy, dappling the forest floor in an ever-shifting mosaic of light and shadow. It was a beautiful place, but for Silas, beauty was secondary to terrain. Every fallen log was potential cover, every stream a natural obstacle, every ridge a potential overwatch position. He and Ghost moved with a terrifying, fluid grace, a two-man reconnaissance team flowing through the wilderness. Silas's movements were economical and precise, his feet finding purchase on the mossy ground without a sound. Ghost moved like a wisp of smoke at his side, his powerful form hugging the shadows, his nose constantly testing the air, reading the stories written on the wind. They were not hiking. They were infiltrating. As they closed in on the GPS coordinates, a palpable wrongness settled over the forest. The natural chorus of birds and insects faded into an unnerving silence. It was the kind of quiet that precedes a storm or a gunshot. Silas signaled Ghost with a single, subtle hand gesture. The dog instantly froze, dropping into a low crouch, his body a taut line of muscle, a low rumble vibrating in his chest. He had scented them. Man scent. Unfamiliar. Wrong. The coordinates led to a small, dilapidated ranger station, a relic from another time. Its windows boarded up, its porch sagging. It sat in a small clearing, a perfect kill box. This was a trap. The SOS was the bait, and he had walked right to it. Silas didn't enter the clearing. He melted into the thick ferns at its edge, his carbine, a civilian model modified to his own exacting specifications, held at a low ready. Ghost remained motionless beside him, a living tripwire. The first shot was not a crack, but a cough. A suppressed round thudded into the tree beside Silas's head, showering him with splinters of bark. A second round followed, aimed at his legs. They weren't trying to kill him. Not yet. This was a capture team. He didn't return fire. He was escaping. He was a weapon without a target. But now he was a target without an angle. Two figures in dark tactical gear emerged from the tree line on the opposite side of the clearing, moving to flank him. They were professionals, clean movements, good spacing. But they made a critical error. They underestimated his partner. With a silent release command from Silas, a barely perceptible tensing of his jaw, Ghost exploded from the ferns. He was not a dog. He was a projectile of focused fury, a black blur covering 50 yards of open ground in seconds. The nearest mercenary had no time to react. He turned, his weapon coming up, just as 75 pounds of canine muscle and bone slammed into his chest. The man went down with a grunt of pain and surprise, his weapon flying from his grasp. Ghost's attack was not wild. It was tactical. He didn't go for the throat. He targeted the weapon arm, his jaws locking on the man's forearm with crushing force. The man screamed, a raw, guttural sound that was abruptly cut short as Silas, using the opening Ghost had created, engaged the second target. Two precise, double taps, center mass. The man crumpled without a sound. Silas was on the first mercenary before he could recover, the one Ghost had pinned. A swift, disabling blow neutralized the threat. The entire engagement had lasted less than 10 seconds. It was brutal, efficient, and utterly silent except for the man's initial scream. Silas checked the neutralized men. No military IDs, expensive, non-standard gear. Mercenaries. He found a satellite phone on the first man. It was heavily encrypted, but the recent call log showed a single recurring number. A quick search on his own device linked the number's routing exchange to a corporate headquarters in downtown Seattle, Croft Industries. Silas and Ghost exfiltrated from the ambush site, leaving no trace of their presence, save for two unconscious, disarmed men who would wake up with a world of pain and a story their employer would not want to hear. He didn't kill them. They were pawns, tools, and dead men told no tales, but wounded men spread fear. He moved to a pre-planned fallback point, a small, hidden cave he had scouted weeks ago, a place of cold stone and absolute darkness. His so-called sanctuary had been compromised. Now the entire forest felt like hostile territory. He was a protector, but in this new, undeclared war, he was also the primary target. Once secure, he contacted Aris. The sat phone's connection was clear, a sterile digital link in the heart of the primal wilderness. "They were waiting for me," he said, his voice a low, controlled monotone. "Two of them, pro gear. It was a capture op." He heard the sharp intake of her breath. "Are you clear?" "For now. Ghost is fine. They weren't expecting him." He could almost hear the gears turning in her head, the triage doctor and the ranger medic assessing the situation, processing the new data. "Silas, I have something," she said, her voice tight with urgency. "You walked right into the hornet's nest. The GPS unit's serial number traces back to a bulk purchase made 6 months ago by a subsidiary of Croft Industries." "Croft Industries?" Silas repeated, the name from the mercenary's phone. "It gets better," Aris continued, the irony in her voice as sharp as a scalpel. "They bought 24 units for a geological survey team operating in the Puget Sound area. 2 weeks ago, Croft Industries filed a report with the Coast Guard. The team's survey vessel, the Odyssey, was lost in a sudden storm. All hands presumed lost. Case closed. It was too clean, too neat. A boating accident was a perfect corporate solution to a human problem. There was no major storm system in that area 2 weeks ago, Silas stated, his mind sifting through his own memory of the recent weather patterns. "I know," Aris said. "I checked the meteorological archives. It was a fabrication, but it gets worse." I dug into the employee manifest for the Odyssey. One of the lead scientists on board was a woman named Dr. Elena Soto, a brilliant marine biologist. 3 weeks ago, a week before the accident, Dr. Soto filed a formal whistleblower complaint with the EPA. A cold certainty began to form in Silas's gut. Against Croft? Against Croft Industries, yes. She alleged that the company, under the guise of their geological surveys, was using a deep-water trench off the coast to illegally dump hundreds of barrels of highly toxic experimental chemical waste from one of their biotech ventures. The complaint was pending review when she and her entire team conveniently disappeared. The pieces slammed together. The SOS. It was from Dr. Soto. She had survived the sinking of the Odyssey. She had set the GPS as a beacon, a desperate cry for help, hoping someone would find it. But Croft's people had been monitoring, waiting. The ranger station wasn't a rendezvous. It was an extermination point. This wasn't just a rescue anymore. It was a race to uncover a corporate conspiracy that had already claimed 12 lives. The legacy Julian Croft was so keen to protect was built on a foundation of poison and murder, and Dr. Soto was the one person left who could bring it all crashing down. Silas was no longer just a man who had found a message in a bottle. He was the guardian of that message, and the only protector a doomed woman had left. The weight of the new reality settled on Silas. He was no longer just a drifter trying to outrun his own shadow. He was now the sole protector of a woman he'd never met, a woman who held the key to dismantling a corrupt empire. The mission had parameters now, a clear objective: find Soto before Croft's hunters did. But how? The GPS coordinate had been a trap. He was at a dead end, a tactical cul-de-sac. He sat on the cold stone floor of the cave, the damp air chilling him, and methodically cleaned his carbine. The familiar, repetitive motions calmed the storm in his mind, allowing the operator to surface. Ghost lay nearby, a silent, watchful presence, his head resting on his paws, but his eyes tracking Silas's every move. The dog could sense the shift, the frustration warring with the cold focus. Silas finished his weapon maintenance and turned his attention back to the evidence: the bloody note, the GPS unit, and the small pelican case that had started it all. He stared at it, turning it over and over in his hands. He had been so focused on the electronics, on the explicit message, that he felt he must have missed something. This was the part of the job he hated and excelled at. The moments between the violence, the quiet, maddening puzzle of predicting an enemy's move. He spoke to Ghost, his voice a low murmur that was more for himself than the dog. It was in these moments, speaking to his silent partner, that his thoughts found their clearest expression. They knew she'd send a signal, buddy. They were waiting for it. So the first signal had to be a feint, a decoy. But she's a scientist, a survivor. She would have a contingency, a backup. Where is it? What did we miss? Ghost, as if understanding the question, rose to his feet. He padded over to where Silas sat and nudged the empty pelican case with his wet nose. He whined softly, a high, insistent sound, then nudged it again, pushing it firmly against Silas's hand. Silas looked down at the dog, then back at the case. I already checked it, Ghost. It's empty. Ghost whined again, more forcefully this time, and nudged the case so hard it almost fell from Silas's lap. The dog's insistence was absolute. He wasn't just playing, he was communicating. He was telling Silas to look again. Trust the dog. It was a rule that had saved his life more than once. Silas opened the case again, the pneumatic seal sighing. He ran his fingers over the custom-cut foam. Nothing. He was about to close it when a glint of reflected light from his headlamp caught his eye. It wasn't in the foam. It was on the lid. He angled the case, letting the light play across the black plastic interior. There, almost invisible to the naked eye, were a series of faint, desperate scratches. They weren't random. They were numbers, a second set of coordinates. Dr. Soto, in her last moments of preparing the buoy, had known she might be walking into a trap. She had created a backup, a message within the message, so subtle it was almost missed. A plan for the person smart enough or desperate enough to look past the obvious. Ghost had not seen the numbers. He had smelled them. The faint, lingering scent of Dr. Soto's fear and determination, concentrated in the tiny scratches she had painstakingly carved into the plastic. The K9 hadn't just found the message, he had revealed the true mystery. The first coordinate was for her hunters. The second was for her protector. The new coordinates were different. They didn't point to the mainland. They pointed north, to the scattered, labyrinthine maze of the San Juan Islands, a much harder place to search, and a much harder place to hide. In a penthouse apartment that seemed to float above the Seattle skyline, Julian Croft stood before a wall of glass, looking down on the city lights as if they were his personal property. The room was a monument to wealth and power, a sterile, minimalist space of chrome, glass, and black leather. It was a world away from the damp earth and primal shadows where Silas Kane was currently operating. The juxtaposition was stark: the corporate predator in his sterile cage and the quiet protector in the untamed wild. Croft was on the phone, his voice a blade of cold, controlled fury. "What do you mean, they're dark?" he snarled into the device. "I pay you for results, not for literary descriptions of failure." On the other end, his head of security, a former intelligence officer named Valerius, spoke in hushed, nervous tones. "Both operatives' trackers are offline. Their last check-in was just before they engaged the target. Then, nothing. We have to assume the target is hostile and effective." Croft's knuckles were white where he gripped the phone. He was a man accustomed to control, to a world that bent to his will and his wallet. This messy, unpredictable variable, this unknown man with the dog, was an infuriating anomaly. "The asset, Dr. Soto? She is a loose end that needs to be tied," Croft said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "The man who found the package is not a variable. He is a threat. I want you to erase them both. I don't care what it costs. Liquidate assets. Call in every marker you have. This is not a negotiation. This is damage control. Sir, the target is clearly a professional. We don't know who he is, where he came from." "I don't pay you for what you don't know," Croft cut him off. "I pay you to solve problems. Find him, find her, and burn the problem to the ground. My legacy is at stake." He ended the call without waiting for a reply, tossing the sleek, wafer-thin phone onto a marble countertop. Legacy. The word was everything to him. The Croft name was synonymous with innovation, with progress, with a certain kind of ruthless American success. That legacy, that carefully constructed public image, was built on a series of brilliant, world-changing technologies. What the public didn't know was that the cost of that progress was sometimes measured in human lives and ecological devastation. Dr. Soto and her team had discovered the company's dirtiest secret, a miracle chemical for agricultural application that had a byproduct so toxic, so persistent, that it couldn't be safely disposed of. So Croft had created his own disposal method, sinking it into the abyss, far from the eyes of regulators. The Odyssey was not a research vessel, it was a garbage scow, and its crew had become inconvenient witnesses. Julian Croft turned back to the window, his reflection a ghostly image superimposed over the sprawling city. He was not a monster in his own mind. He was a pragmatist, a visionary. He was protecting a legacy that, in his view, would do more good for the world than the lives of a few unfortunate scientists. Silas Kane was a different kind of protector. He protected the individual, the helpless, the forgotten. Croft protected the institution, the brand, the bottom line. In the coming conflict, only one definition of legacy could survive. And Julian Croft, lord of his glass tower, had just unleashed the full, terrifying force of his empire to ensure it would be his. The plan to reach the San Juan Islands was fraught with risk. Every commercial ferry, every charter plane, every marina would be watched. Croft's reach was long, and his resources were virtually unlimited. Silas was a ghost, but even ghosts can be seen if you know where to look. They needed a way to slip through the net. Aris provided the solution. "I know a guy," she had said over the phone, her voice low. "An old fisherman out of Anacortes, named Sal. I patched him up a few years ago after he had a nasty argument with a winch. He owes me a favor. His boat isn't pretty, but it's not on any official manifest, and he knows these waters better than the Coast Guard. The rendezvous was set for a derelict pier just after midnight. The air was cold, thick with the smell of diesel, salt, and decaying fish. Sal was a man carved from sea-worn timber, his face a road map of hard years on the water. He looked at Silas, at the tactical bag, at the silent, imposing dog at his side, and then at Aris. He didn't ask questions. He just nodded. The lady says you need a ride. Get on. The journey north was a tense, shuddering passage through black water. The fishing boat, the Sea Serpent, chugged through the choppy waves of the Puget Sound, its engine a low, rhythmic growl. Aris had insisted on coming. Soto might be injured, she'd argued. You're an operator, Silas, not a doctor. You need me. He hadn't fought her on it. She was right, and he knew her ranger training made her an asset, not a liability. She moved with a quiet competence that he recognized and respected. She was a different kind of guardian. They landed on the designated island under the cover of a moonless night, beaching the small boat in a secluded cove masked by a curtain of overhanging trees. The island was a fortress of nature, a maze of sheer rock faces, dense pine forests, and shores littered with treacherous, slippery stones. Silas and Ghost disembarked first, melting into the shadows of the tree line. The dog was in his element, a predator in a wild kingdom, his senses alive and tingling. He wasn't just sniffing the air, he was reading it, dissecting every molecule of information it carried. The scent of pine, of salt, of raccoon and deer, and something else, faint, old, the scent of a human, wounded, hiding, frightened. Ghost took the lead, guiding them not with speed, but with a slow, deliberate certainty. He led them away from the shore, up a steep, winding game trail, deeper into the island's dark heart. Aris followed close behind Silas, her medical pack secure on her back, her movements sure-footed and silent. The sounds of their passage were swallowed by the rush of a nearby waterfall. The sound of the waterfall grew louder, a constant roar that masked their approach. Ghost stopped at the base of a sheer rock wall, water cascading down its face in a silver sheet. It looked like a dead end, but the dog was insistent, whining softly and pawing at the curtain of water. Silas pushed through the frigid spray. Behind the waterfall was a narrow fissure in the rock, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through. It opened into a small, dry cave, and there, huddled in the far corner, was a woman. She was thin, pale, and her eyes were wide with a mixture of terror and defiance. A makeshift splint was tied to her arm. Beside her, clutched to her chest like a holy relic, was a ruggedized hard case. Dr. Elena Soto. She flinched as they entered, a small wounded animal ready to fight to the death. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice raspy. Silas didn't answer immediately. He knelt, keeping his distance, his hands open and visible. He simply looked at her, then at Ghost, his silent, steadfast partner. He was a protector. He had found his charge. Dr. Soto's story came out in a torrent, a flood of information held back by weeks of terror and isolation. She spoke of Julian Croft's ambition, his charm, and the chilling pragmatism that lay beneath it. She described the chemical, Cronus 7, a revolutionary soil nutrient with a catastrophic flaw. Its waste product was a bioaccumulative neurotoxin of unparalleled virulence. He called it the cost of progress, she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of grief and rage. We found out they weren't neutralizing the waste. They were just disappearing it, sinking it in the trench. When we confronted them, they smiled, promised a full internal review. The internal review was the sinking of the Odyssey. It was swift, brutal, and disguised as a tragic accident. A sudden explosion in the engine room at night, the ship going down in minutes. She only survived because she had been on deck, thrown clear by the blast. She had clung to a floating debris field for 2 days before washing up on the mainland, where she had assembled her desperate SOS package. The hard case she clutched contained everything. The full data on Cronus 7, internal memos from Croft's office ordering the cover-up, and submersible footage of the barrels being dumped. It was the evidence that could burn his empire to the ground. As she finished speaking, her words hanging in the damp air of the cave, Ghost, who had been lying quietly at the entrance, suddenly lifted his head. A low growl, deep and menacing, rumbled in his chest. It wasn't a warning of approach. It was a statement of arrival. They were here. Silas was already moving. Aris, get her to the back of the cave. Keep her down. He didn't need to look outside. He could hear it now. Beneath the roar of the waterfall, the subtle crunch of boots on gravel, the whisper of a marine engine idling just offshore. Croft's hunters had found them. The cave, their temporary sanctuary, was about to become a tomb or a fortress. Silas's mind shifted into the cold, clear state of tactical awareness. He was no longer a man seeking peace. He was a guardian, defending his post. This small, dark space was now the most important piece of ground in the world. He wedged himself into a narrow alcove near the entrance, a position that offered cover and a clear field of fire through the waterfall's curtain. The world outside was a distorted, shimmering blur. Then, the first muzzle flash. A burst of suppressed automatic fire ripped through the water, the rounds smacking into the rock wall behind him with angry, percussive impacts. The siege had begun. Croft's mercenaries were better equipped this time, more numerous. They advanced in a disciplined formation, using the rocks along the shoreline for cover, attempting to establish a dominant firing position. But they were fighting in Silas's world now. The world of shadows, angles, and calculated violence. He was a phantom. He would fire 2 rounds from his position, then disappear back into the darkness of the cave, only to reappear in a different spot seconds later. He made them think he was more than one man. Aris was not idle. She had Dr. Soto lying flat, shielded by a rock formation, and was checking her vitals, her calm professionalism a stark contrast to the chaos outside. She acted as a spotter for Silas, her sharp eyes catching glimpses of movement he might miss. 2 men, flanking right, moving toward the high ground, she called out. Silas acknowledged with a nod. Ghost was a sentinel of black fury. He held his position at Silas's side, a coiled spring of lethal intent. When one of the mercenaries, emboldened, made a dash for the cave entrance, Silas gave the silent command. Ghost launched himself through the waterfall, a terrifying, silent apparition of teeth and muscle. The impact, the scream, the drag of a body back into the rocks, it was enough. It broke their momentum. It sowed fear. Silas took advantage of the hesitation, neutralizing another attacker who was trying to lay down suppressive fire. He slid back into his alcove, reloading a fresh magazine with practiced efficiency. He caught Aris's eye. She gave him a grim, determined nod. They were a team. A doctor, a warrior, and a dog. a small, defiant island of resistance against a tide of corporate malice. The fight devolved into a brutal stalemate. For every push the mercenaries made, Silas and Ghost answered with precise, economical violence. But the math was against them. They were a finite force against a seemingly endless supply of ammunition and men. The air in the cave grew thick with the smell of cordite and ozone. Silas was down to his last 2 magazines. Aris was low on anything but basic bandages. Time was running out. Then a new voice cut through the din of the waterfall and sporadic gunfire. A voice amplified by a bullhorn, slick and confident. "The man in the cave, we know you're in there. My name is Valerius. I'm authorized by Mr. Croft to make you a final offer." Silas remained silent, his carbine steady. He could see the man, Valerius, standing behind a large boulder, holding the bullhorn. He was the commander, the head of the snake. "We don't want you," Valerius continued, his voice echoing unnaturally against the rocks. "You're a professional. We respect that. Our target is the woman. Give us Dr. Soto and the hard case she's carrying. You and your friends can walk away. In fact, Mr. Croft is prepared to offer a substantial payment for your trouble. A retirement fund. No one ever has to know you were here." Silas didn't flinch. He glanced back at Aris, who was shielding Dr. Soto's body with her own. He looked at Soto, her eyes wide with terror, clutching the hard case that represented her life's work and her colleague's final legacy. He looked at Ghost, panting softly at his side, the dog's unwavering loyalty a physical presence in the cave. This wasn't about a retirement fund. This was about a promise made to a bloody SOS note, a duty to protect the helpless. He was a guardian. This was his post. He turned to Aris, his voice a low whisper. "There's a channel, back of the cave. I saw it when we came in, submerged. It might lead out to the sea on the other side of this rock face." Aris's eyes widened. "You want us to swim for it?" "It's not a request," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "It's the only way. I'll create a diversion. When you hear the bang, you go. Don't wait for me. Get Soto and that case to the water. Ghost will go with you." He unclipped the last 2 flashbang grenades from his vest. He had been saving them. He also had a small, improvised explosive charge he had assembled from scavenged materials, a trick learned in a dusty, forgotten war. It was a desperate, one-shot plan. He gave Ghost a final, firm pat on the head and a quiet command. "Watch them. Protect them." The dog seemed to understand, pressing his head against Silas's leg for a brief moment before turning his attention to Aris. Silas took a deep breath, the cold, damp air filling his lungs. He was no longer escaping. He was attacking. With a primal roar, he hurled the first flashbang out through the waterfall. The world erupted in a blinding flash of white light and a deafening concussion. As the mercenaries recoiled in shock and disorientation, he threw the second, followed by his improvised charge, aimed at a weak point in the rock face above their primary position. "Go, now!" he yelled at Aris. She didn't hesitate, pulling the terrified Dr. Soto toward the dark, churning water at the back of the cave. Ghost was right with them, a dark shadow guiding their path. The second explosion rocked the cave, sending a shower of rock and debris down on the mercenaries' position. The diversion was set. Silas fired his remaining rounds in a sweeping arc, forcing their heads down. And then, with the enemy suppressed, he turned and plunged into the frigid, black water after them. The shock of the cold water was a physical blow, stealing the air from Silas's lungs. The submerged tunnel was a black, claustrophobic nightmare, its unseen walls scraping against his shoulders. He pushed forward, fighting the panic that clawed at the edges of his training, his entire focus on the faint, kicking outline of Aris ahead of him. After an eternity that was likely less than a minute, they burst through the surface on the far side of the headland, gasping in the salty night air. They were exposed, treading water in a small, rocky cove. Aris was supporting Dr. Soto, who was coughing and sputtering, but alive. Ghost paddled nearby, his head held high, a tireless engine of loyalty. They had made it, but they were not safe. The sound of the marine engine roared to life, rounding the point. A rigid-hulled inflatable boat, RHIB, sliced through the water, a searchlight sweeping the darkness and landing squarely on them. They were caught, illuminated like specimens in a jar. Valerius was at the helm, 2 of his men in the bow, their weapons trained on the small group in the water. Silas pushed Aris and Soto behind a small rock outcropping. It was meager cover. They were out of options, out of ammunition, and out of time. As the RHIB bore down on them, Aris fumbled with the hard case. She cracked it open, pulling out a small, ruggedized tablet and a satellite modem. "If we're going down, the truth is going with us," she hissed, her fingers flying across the screen, initiating a data burst of Soto's evidence to a secure server and every major news outlet on a pre-prepared list. It was a final, defiant act. But before the upload could complete, a new sound split the night. The thumping, rhythmic beat of helicopter blades. A sleek, black helicopter, a civilian model that screamed money and power, descended from the low-hanging clouds, its landing lights bathing the entire scene in an impossibly bright glare. It hovered 50 feet above them, the rotor wash whipping the water into a frenzy. In the open door of the helicopter, a man stood silhouetted, holding a scoped sniper rifle. Even from a distance, his arrogant posture was unmistakable. Julian Croft. He wasn't going to let his hired help fail him again. He was here to personally oversee the erasure of his problem. Ghost, treading water beside Silas, let out a furious volley of barks, a primal challenge to the machine in the sky. The end was here. A single, well-placed shot, and it would all be over. The evidence, the witnesses, the mission. Failure. Silas's mind was a vortex of tactical calculations, but there were no moves left. Then his hand brushed against the flare gun on his vest, a standard piece of maritime survival gear. He had one flare, one shot. It was a signal device, not a weapon, useless against an armored helicopter. He looked at Croft, a spectre of death in the sky. He looked at Aris, her face a mask of grim determination as she protected the data upload. He looked at Soto, the woman he had sworn to protect. He wasn't going to die as a target. He would die as a protector. He raised the flare gun, not at the helicopter. That was a fool's hope. He aimed it straight up into the belly of the dark clouds. He pulled the trigger. A brilliant red comet screamed into the sky, exploding in a shower of crimson light. It was a final, desperate cry, a beacon of defiance, a flare that didn't just signal for help, but announced to the world, "We are here. We are fighting. We will not be silenced." The red flare burned against the low clouds, a bleeding wound in the night sky. For a moment, everything stood still. Julian Croft, high in his aerial throne, hesitated. The flare was an unexpected variable, an act of defiance so pointless it was almost poetic. But it wasn't pointless. Down in the churning water, Aris looked up from the tablet, a fierce, triumphant grin on her face. "Upload complete," she shouted over the rotor wash. "It's out. It's all out." Simultaneously, a new sound joined the cacophony. The deeper, more authoritative thrum of a second helicopter, followed by the urgent horn of a fast-approaching cutter. The Coast Guard. Alerted by Aris's emergency data broadcast and drawn by the flare, they were converging on the scene with overwhelming force. Croft's helicopter, caught in the sudden glare of a military-grade searchlight, abruptly banked and pulled away, retreating into the darkness. Croft was trapped. His hunt was over. The law was coming for him, and all the money in the world couldn't build a wall high enough to stop it. The aftermath was a blur of official procedure and quiet relief. Croft and Valerius were apprehended before they could make it back to the mainland. The story of Croft Industries, the Cronus 7 toxin, and the murder of the Odyssey's crew became a global scandal. Dr. Soto's evidence, disseminated by Aris's desperate broadcast, was irrefutable. The legacy Julian Croft had killed to protect was now a legacy of shame. The sanctuary, Silas's small cabin on the bluff, was finally peaceful. The oppressive mist had lifted, replaced by a cool, clear morning. The sun glinted off a calm sea. It was a picture of the peace he had originally sought, but it felt different now. Earned. Aris was there, carefully stitching a shallow graze on Silas's forearm, a souvenir from the siege. Her touch was clinical, yet gentle. The silence between them was no longer one of distance, but of shared experience. "You think you'll find that peace you were looking for now?" she asked quietly, her eyes focused on her work. Silas didn't answer right away. He looked at Ghost, who was lying at his feet, the dog's head resting on his knee, a silent, comforting weight. He thought of the mission, the chase, the feeling of purpose that had burned away the fog of his civilian life. "I'm a protector," he said, his voice soft but sure. "Peace isn't a place you find, Aris. It's a purpose you make." A few days later, Silas and Ghost were on the beach again, the same stretch of grey sand where the journey had begun. The cycle was complete, but he was a changed man. The stillness was still there, but it was no longer the stillness of a weapon in storage. It was the calm of a guardian at his post, a sentinel watching over his small piece of the world. He was no longer adrift. He was anchored. He had found his war in the heart of peace, and in protecting another's legacy, he had redefined his own. The world was still a dangerous place, but now he knew his place in it. He threw a piece of driftwood, and Ghost, with a joyful bark that echoed across the water, bounded after it. A warrior and his partner, finally, truly, at peace. Silas found his war in the heart of peace, and in protecting another's legacy, he redefined his own. His sanctuary was not a place, but a promise. Tell us where you are watching from, and what loyalty means to you. Comment Amen below if you believe in the power of a faithful protector. God blesses you and your families.